What if the one maneuver your training manual swore would kill you was the only thing that could save your life? Picture 1942, the vast Pacific, and a string of young American pilots seeing the Mitsubishi A6M Zero for the first time, impossibly light, impossibly nimble, a phantom that could turn inside their wake. Their planes were built like flying fortresses. Theirs was a handbook full of rules. Their go-to tactic, boom and zoom, promised safety. But in practice, it was failing. Men who followed the book were getting picked off. The rule book that was supposed to keep them alive might be the thing getting them killed. 1942, the Pacific Theater. For newly arrived American pilots, the first sight of the Mitsubishi A6M Zero is a heart-stopping shock. It looks like a ghost feather light, impossibly nimble, nothing like the heavy, steady fighters they'd been taught to fly. Where U.S. planes relied on mass and momentum, the Zero seemed to flit and pivot as if gravity were optional, turning on a dime and climbing away before you could reload. Talk on the flight line turns to myth. Veteran voices, half laughing, half terrified, radio calls clipped and urgent. That first encounter doesn't just scare them. It shatters their assumptions and forces a brutal, immediate rethink of how to survive in the sky. Think of them as opposite weapons. The American fighters were broadswords, heavy, armored, engines built for raw power and to soak up punishment, planes that could take a hit and keep coming. The Zero was a fencer's blade, impossibly light, barely there, designed to dance instead of crash through the fight. That weight difference wasn't academic. It changed everything you could do in the sky. Where the U.S. ship wanted stability and momentum, the Zero wanted nimble, razor-thin motion, snap turns, sudden climbs, a ghostly slipperiness that made grown pilots pause. In a single heartbeat, design became tactic. The machines dictated the rules. In the air, that advantage becomes brutal and immediate. The Zero could snap into a turn on a dime, then peel off and climb like a rocket, slipping inside an American fighter's turning circle as if gravity didn't apply. 40 seconds, and Wildcats felt ponderous by comparison. Big, powerful, but slow to respond, leaving stunned American pilots watching a phantom dance just out of reach. Worse, the Japanese pilots are not rookies. They are battle-hardened masters, veterans forged over China in long, brutal patrols and dogfights, logging thousands of combat hours before the U.S. even woke to the Pacific. That experience shows instinct, timing, split-second discipline. They fly with a calm hunger that turns the Zero's preternatural agility into a lethal chess piece, baiting, fighting, and punishing mistakes as if the sky itself were a sharpening ground. For fresh American pilots, green, trained on simulators and textbooks, the sight of those seasoned aces in the clouds feels like stepping into a different sport. And the Americans have one doctrine: boom and zoom. The American playbook had one desperate answer: boom and zoom. Climb high, dive like a hammer from the sun, fire one brutal burst, then use the plane's mass and speed to climb back out. Don't turn, don't chase. Short, violent strikes on your terms. It was textbook, surgical, and simple until the Zero pilots learned how to bait it. But the Zero pilots weren't flummoxed. They'd seen boom and zoom 1,000 times and learned to treat it like bait. Patient, practiced, almost casual Japanese pilots would let an American dive in, let him feel the rush of speed and the certainty of the kill. Then, at the exact moment the attacker committed, they'd do something almost insultingly simple: stop chasing the speed and turn the fight into the one place the Zero ruled. It looked like a trick, and it was. To the hungry, impulsive pilot, it looked like an opening, To the veteran Zero driver, it was the trapdoor that closed with surgical finality. As an American P-40 or Wildcat dives, the Zero pilot does not flinch, he waits. Calm as a coiled spring, he lets the heavy fighter come screaming in, then snaps his stick over and rips the little Mitsubishi into a tight, impossible horizontal turn. What looks like a simple maneuver is lethal. The Zero can cut inside the bigger plane's arc before the attacker can even react. If the American pilot gives in to instinct and follows the turn, if muscle memory and training tell him to chase the trap, snaps shut. His eyes fix on the Zero. He pulls the stick, he begins the circle, but this isn't drama, it's math. Heavy fighters carry energy and momentum. They need a wider arc to change direction. The Zero's featherweight frame and low wing loading let it cut inside that arc like a knife. Physics is merciless. Angles, speed, and turn radius add up, and in that ledger, the heavier plane loses. Follow the turn, and you fly straight into a perfect, lethal firing solution. When an American pilot lets instinct take over and tries to follow that turn, there's no outsmarting the physics. The Zero simply slices inside the heavier plane's radius and points its guns like a predator locking onto prey. It isn't flair or luck. It's geometry and weight, altitude and rate of roll working against you. The nimble Japanese fighter snaps a tighter circle, bleeds off less speed, and pops into the attacker's blind spot with lethal precision. In those seconds, the odds harden into numbers. More hits, more crippling strikes, and kill ratios that read like cold arithmetic, grim, brutal, and unforgiving. Command boiled it down to one icy sentence: never, ever get into a turning fight with a Zero. It sounded simple, authoritative, and life-saving a rule to cling to when the sky turned violent. But rules are written on paper, not in the cockpit, and they forget two things pilots learn the hard way: that instinct is a loud thing, and that the enemy reads your playbook. What looked like common sense on briefings left out a cruel reality waiting a few thousand feet up, an opponent who could make that very rule into a noose. The order held hope, but hope alone wouldn't win. They turned the manual against you, using baiting tactics, peeling away, feigning damage, pretending to falter. Japanese pilots lured hot-headed American flyers into a deadly, inescapable carousel. The bait looked obvious: a wounded Zero. The kill looked irresistible: a turn fight to finish. What followed was brutal. The light, razor-sharp Zero cut inside the heavier plane circle, and the American fighter paid the price. They were trapped. The old rules that had won battles back home, dive, hit, and climb, were breaking down against an enemy that refused to play by them. Zeros baited American fighters into the one fight, the U.S. Planes couldn't win, and Doctrine turned from a lifesaver into a noose. Veteran pilots, the ones who taught rookies how to live, were being hammered out of the sky faster than they could be replaced. Aircraft were lost, missions failed, and whole squadrons watched their experience evaporate. Commanders scrambled, training pipelines strained, morale frayed. Whatever came next had to change everything. They're up against an opponent who doesn't just beat them, he changes the game itself, owning the one arena that decides life or death: the sky. Every tactic they practiced, every muscle memory drilled into them, suddenly maps to disaster. The lightweight Zero turns like a needle. Their heavy fighters swing like hammers. What was once taught as gospel becomes a coffin lined with polished steel. Training manuals become tombstones. Pilots aren't losing a few engagements, they're bleeding out entire squadrons. The rule book that kept men alive back home now reads like a verdict. If they don't find something different, they will not survive. They are running out of pilots. Planes are intact. but men are dying faster than they can be replaced. The old rules, boom and zoom, don't turn with a zero, were simple, comforting, taught like gospel. Comfort now feels like a coffin. What they need isn't a better engine or another wingman, it's a change so radical it reads like treason against every flight manual. Survival will demand improvisation, a willingness to flirt with the plane's limits and your own body in ways instructors warned against, to gamble 2 terrifying seconds for the chance to live. Who will be brave enough to try? It required something the training manuals explicitly forbid. Not a clever tweak, but a full-on violation of everything pilots had been beaten into believing. Don't pull negative Gs. Don't fly upside down. Don't invite the pressure that floods your skull and blinds you for heartbeats at a time. On paper, it read like suicide. In the air, it felt like sacrilege. And yet the rulebook was killing men. When doctrine equals the grave, desperation rewrites the rules. Sooner or later, someone would risk the taboo roll inverted, dive into the red, and find out if the thing that terrified them could actually save their life. The solution didn't come from a strategist. It came from a moment of pure desperation. Lieutenant Richard Bong, strapped into his twin-boom P-38 Lightning, finds himself with a zero on his tail and nowhere to run. Training screamed never. Command handed down doctrine, but doctrine meant death. So, instead of following the rulebook, he makes a single, impossible decision, one that will rewrite the playbook. The zero is on his tail. Bong does the unthinkable. He pushes the stick forward and flips his P-38 completely upside down. For a beat, the world upends, instruments wobble. Blood roars to his head. Training screams in his ears while his heavy fighter, inverted and terrifying, becomes a falling bullet. It's a move no manual would endorse, but he commits. Bong plummets, nose angled back toward the ocean, plunging into a stomach-churning dive. The zero on his tail snaps its head, then freezes, caught off guard and unable to follow the violent inversion. Wind roars past the cockpit. Gauges and horizons smear. For a brutal heartbeat, he trades comfort for raw speed, buying precious seconds the zero simply cannot match, and something dangerous begins to take hold. It broke every rule a man in a cockpit had ever been taught. Bong's flinch into the inverted dive didn't just surprise his attacker, it shoved his body into a brutal physiological corner called red out. Blood slammed into his head so hard his eyes felt as if they were being pressed from their sockets. Vision flooded with a hot, pulsing crimson. Sound narrowed to a high, distant roar. For 2, maybe 3 seconds, he was literally blind while his Mustang plunged toward the ocean at terrifying speed. Training had always warned pilots about Gs, but always the opposite problem, the gray out of positive pull, and the idea of using that terrible, blinding force as a deliberate escape sounded like madness. Standard combat pulls you the other way. Positive Gs shove blood down, away from your brain, and the body pays the price. Gray vision, then blackout if you don't fight it. Pilots are drilled on that fight until it's reflex, the G-straining maneuver, clamping your legs and belly, timing breaths, trusting the G-suit to squeeze you back into circulation. Lose that reflex for a second at 3 or 4 G and you hand the sky to the enemy, which is exactly why what these men were about to try felt like madness. It would invert everything they'd been taught. But negative Gs do the opposite. Instead of blood being pulled away from the brain, your own circulation becomes a battering ram, driving blood hard into the skull. The pressure hits like a hydraulic jack behind your eyes, face throbbing, ears booming, tiny blood vessels bulging under the strain. Colors smear and collapse into a single, terrifying wash of crimson. Peripheral vision narrows to tunnel. For a few awful seconds, you're not just in pain, you're effectively blind, fighting disorientation while your aircraft screams through the sky. It's a brutal, counterintuitive force that training treated as something to be avoided at all costs. Pilots described it like a living force, an unbearable pressure that felt as if their eyeballs were being shoved out of their sockets. Then suddenly the world flooded with a molten, crimson wash that swallowed shapes and depth alike. For a heartbeat that stretched into an eternity, they were blind, their instruments a blur, their guts lurching as pain hammered behind their eyes. Yet the throttle still had to be managed, a roaring metal beast beneath them, demanding hands and instinct while vision failed. It was terrifying, disorienting, almost sacramental horror and survival braided together, and to doctors back home, it looked like a human body being pushed beyond reason. To the flight surgeons and squadron commanders of 1942, negative G wasn't a quirky hazard, it was a hard boundary. Textbooks, training films, and cold medical briefs all agreed. Blood rushing into the skull was more than pain. It was a hazard that could rob you of sight, wreck a mission, and kill a man who tried it for sport. Doctrine stamped the warning into every pilot's head: avoid negative G at all costs. Some instructors put it bluntly: a deliberate negative G dive was almost indistinguishable from controlled suicide. The idea of twisting your airplane into that zone was officially forbidden and unthinkable. For 2 to 3 heart-stopping seconds, you were literally blind, hurtling through the sky at over 400 miles an hour with nothing but instinct and a burning skull to guide you. It wasn't just pain, it was a blackout of the senses, a crimson tunnel that erased the world for the span of a coffee sip. In textbook terms, it was madness. In combat, it was a gamble with life on one side and death on the other. But when the alternative was being outturned and picked apart, could that terrifying, blinding flaw actually be turned into a weapon? In the lethal calculus of air combat, 2 seconds of blindness suddenly looks like a bargain. 2 terrifying seconds traded for the slimmest chance of staying alive. Pilots begin to think in new brutal math. Better a momentary readout than the slow certainty of being chewed up in a turning fight. The idea is ugly and simple: embrace the negative G, roll inverted, dive like a stone, convert altitude into unmatchable speed, let the enemy misread a feint for panic, then reappear from below with the advantage. It's forbidden, painful, almost insane. And yet, as fear hardens into strategy, a brilliant, desperate plan starts to take shape. April 1943. Major Thomas Lynch becomes the first to turn the terrible gamble into an offensive weapon. Ambushed by Zeros, he watches the trap close and does the opposite of every rule he ever learned. Where others would wrestle for a turning fight, Lynch chooses the absurd: complete inversion and a falling dive, not to flee, but to harvest speed and surprise. For a heartbeat, it looks like a panic. Then, with a pilot's cold calculation, that apparent retreat becomes the bait that will let him punch back harder than anyone imagined. Ambushed and with the trap closing, Lynch does the unthinkable. He yanks the P-38 hard, rolls it inverted, and drives the nose into a savage dive. The world flips. Instruments blur. The sky becomes a streak. He chooses the red-out welcomes, the blood rush, and the burning pressure behind his eyes, because 2 seconds of blindness beats being trapped in a Zero's turn. The lightning screams earthward, speed piling up like an unspent weapon. Below, the Japanese pilots watch him tumble and shake their heads, baffled and convinced he's panicking, not realizing he's already rewritten the fight. The Zero pilots sit stunned, watching him plummet, flipped upside down, nose diving away like a wounded bird. To their eyes, it's a panicked, uncontrolled escape, a kill about to be claimed. Confusion freezes them. They peel off or hang back, sure the Yank is running completely unaware that the plunge is exactly what he planned. He isn't just running. He's trading height for raw velocity, flipping potential energy into a screaming dive that the light Zero simply can't follow. As he nosedives, speed builds monstrously. Airspeed needles needle, wind howls, control surfaces, bite. That burst of kinetic energy makes him effectively untouchable in the vertical plane. The Zeros, designed to dance slowly in turns, lack the structure and engines to match the madness of that plunge. Far below, he recovers from the dive as the crimson haze fades and sight rushes back. He levels the P-38, steadies the nose, and rolls into a tight circle, turning altitude into raw speed. In one fluid motion, he peels upward, climbing hard beneath his unsuspecting pursuers, slipping into their blind spot with the calm of a hunter and the acceleration to make his next pass brutally decisive. From the blind spot beneath them, Lynch waited like a viper and then struck guns, stuttering to life, tracers streaming up into the startled blue. A single, savage burst and two Zeros went rigid, wings folding, smoke and canvas shredding as they spun away. There was no slow-motion heroics, no time to register the threat. They never knew what hit them. Lynch eased off the throttle, chest pounding, rolling out beneath a sky suddenly rearranged. What looked like a desperate plummet had just become a precise, deadly ambush. It flipped everything. What had been a last-ditch panic move now read like a calculated strike. Lynch didn't just escape, he weaponized the thing every instructor had warned against, turning vertigo and red out into a momentary advantage that rewrote the rules of engagement. Word of the maneuver spread fast. Vets taught rookies in hushed tones, and square-jawed squadron commanders began to wonder if the manuals had been wrong all along. Suddenly, the forbidden roll and dive was no longer a reckless gamble, but a tactic that could seize the initiative, force the enemy into mistakes, and, crucially, exploit weaknesses no one had looked for before. What Lynch stumbled onto wasn't just a clever escape, it was the accidental discovery of two fatal weaknesses in the Zero's legend. First, that featherlight airframe that made the Japanese fighter feel like a dancer couldn't take the brutal loads of a high-speed inverted dive. Stress that an American P-38 shrugged off could literally rip a Zero's wings apart. And second, the Zero's carbureted engine, fine for gentle dogfights, would choke and flood when the plane went upside down, cutting power at the worst possible moment. A maneuver that left an American pilot briefly blinded became a death sentence for anyone who tried to follow. The first flaw was almost poetic. The Zero's featherlight frame that made it a master of the turn was the very thing that betrayed it in a plunge. Built for agility, not brute force, the Japanese fighter traded armor and structural reserve for razor-thin weight savings, so when an American rolled inverted and dove, the loads on the Zero became catastrophic. What felt like nimbleness at low speed turned into brittle weakness at hundreds of miles an hour. Wings that could twist, rivets that could pop, control surfaces that could tear away. In short, a maneuver that was merely painful for a P-47 could be fatal for a Zero. And that wasn't even the worst of it. Worse than fragile wings was an engine that literally couldn't breathe upside down. The Zero's carbureted power plant relied on gravity and a delicate float chamber, so when the aircraft was rolled inverted, the fuel either flooded the intake or was cut off. The mixture fouled, and the engine would cough, sputter, and die, right when a pilot needed thrust the most. In a split second, a nimble fighter became a powerless glider, stalled and helpless, while an American Lightning or Thunderbolt, built with different, more robust fuel systems, could convert altitude into speed, swing back up, and turn that sudden blackout into a kill. American fighters, by contrast, were built like tanks, stout airframes, beefier wings, and, crucially, fuel-injected engines that kept humming even when inverted. What for a Zero was a death sentence going belly up in a high-speed dive was for an American pilot a brutal few seconds. Red out, pounding head, a gut-churning loss of sight. Yes, it hurt, it terrified. But the airframe held. The engine kept pulling. That asymmetry turned the taboo maneuver from suicide into strategy. A painful, controlled sacrifice of a heartbeat for survival and speed. An exploit of design, not bravery. And oddly, none of it was written in the training manuals. It didn't come from a manual or a formal briefing. It spread like a secret handshake, whispered in smoke-filled ready rooms and traded over chipped coffee cups on dusty airstrips, a half smile and a crude sketch on a grease-stained map. Pilots who'd survived passed it down in low voices between inspections and before dawn takeoffs, showing when to roll, when to puke blood, and keep the stick steady, which altitudes to trade for speed. It moved fast, not in memos but in practice, in gruff advice and late-night debriefs, a quiet, brutal lesson taught by the men who'd already cheated death. It became life-saving gospel, an unwritten sermon passed mouth to ear from veteran to rookie in the smoke-filled ready rooms, and on the dusty flight line, a secret handshake that read, "If you're cornered, embrace the terror and dive." Men like Major Charles MacDonald of the 475th didn't talk theory. They talked survival, swearing the move had pulled them out of impossible scrapes more than once. Stories spread between coffee and cigarette smoke, in quiet debriefs and hurried pre-flight huddles, carried by pilots who'd lived to tell it practical, brutal wisdom that saved lives long before anyone would put it in a manual. Squadron leaders knew it was happening. They heard the stories, saw the returns planes that came back with shredded pride or never came back at all, and they made a choice. Officially, the book still said, "Avoid negative Gs." Publicly, the line was strict. Privately, it was a different story. In debrief rooms and late-night briefings, commanders would quietly nod, pass along the trick, and emphatically not put it on paper. No written endorsement. No traceable order if a practice run went wrong. It was plausible deniability by design, a tacit permission slip because, in the end, saving pilots mattered more than doctrine. Word spread in whispers, not through memos, but in hangars and over beer, and from those whispers, an unofficial doctrine took shape. Engage from above, make one high-speed pass, bleed off altitude, and if the enemy turns to meet you as you climb away, roll the airplane upside down and dive. Short, brutal, controlled. Reset the fight on your terms. Commanders looked the other way. Squadron leaders kept it off the books for plausible deniability. It was a field-born playbook, simple to say and terrifying to execute, and it begged a question the manuals refused to answer. Could a pilot learn to use the blinding red out as a weapon? But to use the tactic meant something darker than a trick in the manual. Pilots had to learn to survive the horror of a red out. For a few savage seconds, their world flooded with blood and pain, sight gone, instruments useless, the sky a screaming crimson. So they improvised. They learned to brace, jaw clenched, legs locked, throat tightened, training their bodies to shorten the blackout. They practiced controlled dives until panic became muscle memory. They forced themselves to keep a sliver of peripheral sight, to fly by feel and instinct. It was brutal, it was scary, and it was the only thing between them and death. They learned to turn panic into procedure, clench the jaw, lock the shoulders, bite down and ride the wave because, for 2 terrifying seconds, the world went crimson and the cockpit became a blind, roaring tunnel. Still, Through that bloody fog, they kept the airplanes level by muscle memory and instruments, trusting a fingertip on the throttle, a foot on the rudder, the tremor in the stick. It was ugly, intimate work. Vets teaching rookies how to peel back a sliver of peripheral sight and fly by gut. A dangerous craft honed between missions and whispered in ready rooms, every successful recovery, a small, savage miracle. Flight Surgeon Captain James Moorhead watched the cost in living color. Men staggered back from sorties with eyes streaked red. Tiny vessels burst across the whites, and their heads felt like drums, relentless, pounding, unforgiving. They could barely focus, could barely laugh. They walked as if someone had run them through a gauntlet of pressure and pain. He logged complaints of double vision, nausea, and a crushing, blinding pressure that could last for minutes, and he stayed up nights trying to separate permanent injury from the acute terror of the readout, because if they could endure it, they could fly again. And yet, the grim reports had a surprising addendum. Moorhead found no lasting harm. The burst vessels healed. The pounding headaches faded. What looked like permanent damage on the flight line turned out to be temporary, horrific in the moment, but not forever. That realization changed everything. Terror eased into a cold calculation. If the body could survive a few seconds of crimson panic, then the maneuver was not a death sentence, but a risk to be managed. Suddenly, pilots could experiment, push limits, and learn techniques to shorten the blackout. What had been forbidden began to feel dangerously and beautifully possible. Fear was the price of survival in those cockpits. What started as a panic, eyeballs pushed back, vision flooded with red, was hammered into habit. Pilots learned to bite down, tense every muscle, ride the crimson blur by feel and instinct. Vets showed rookies how to keep a sliver of peripheral sight, how to trust airspeed and the hum of the engine when sight failed. It was brutal. Guys came back with burst vessels and headaches, but not broken. The ritual of embracing the readout became a rite of passage, rough, necessary, and ordinary. And with that ordinary courage, a new kind of fighting was born. By late 1943, the tide was turning. What began as a whispered life-saving trick in foxholes and flight lines was slipping out of the shadows and into the briefings. The secret handshake that kept pilots alive on desperate days was no longer just folklore passed over coffee. Commanders started to nod, trainers began to listen, and tactical notes moved from margins into lesson plans. It was a quiet revolution, a forbidden dive, once taboo, becoming a taught response. Men who'd been mocked for rolling inverted now found their moves written into doctrine. The battlefield itself was changing the rules, and the air war would never be the same. Colonel Neil Kirby didn't just wink at the improvised trick, he weaponized it. Seeing that the P-47's rugged frame and raw power could turn a terrifying stunt into a repeatable tactic, he ripped the move out of the shadows and stamped it into doctrine. Invert, dive, bleed energy, then come up and strike. It was a dangerous bureaucratic gamble, formalizing something commanders had quietly tolerated, but Kirby knew doctrine wins wars. Making the inverted dive official changed everything. What had been a whispered secret became the unit's standard playbook, and the lumbering Thunderbolt began to look less like a clumsy workhorse and more like a purpose-built predator. He drilled his pilots relentlessly in vertical combat, turning routines into muscle memory. Endless altitude drills, timed dives, snap rolls, and recovery under blaring engines. The P-47, once dismissed as a lumbering bruiser, learned to trade armor for momentum. Pilots learned to harvest energy and spend it with brutal economy. They climbed like mountains, dove like bullets, and practiced the inverted plunge until the readout became a known cost, not a paralyzing terror. Training hardened reflexes and rewired instincts, the heavy thunderbolt turned into a predator that refused to be dragged into a turning ring, and confidence spread through the squadron like wildfire. Soon, Marine F-4U Corsair pilots picked up the trick, and with the Corsair's raw power, it became brutal. These planes could hammer into a dive, pile on speed, and snap back up with energy the Zeros simply couldn't match. What started as a desperate escape turned into a predator's tool, and within months, the tactic was jumping from Marines to carrier decks. By mid-1944, the trick that began as a frightened reflex had graduated to doctrine. Navy carrier squadrons were being officially briefed on the split S, or inverted dive, taught not as a last-ditch stunt, but as a standard defensive and offensive move against the Zero. What had been whispered in hangars and traded over coffee was now on the carrier deck in black and white: how to roll over, dump altitude, take the pain of red out for 2 seconds, and come back crashing up under an enemy who couldn't follow. The secret handshake became fleet-wide procedure, turning improvisation into organized advantage and setting the stage for terrifying, game-changing encounters. At first, Japanese pilots completely misinterpreted the maneuver. They watched an American fighter roll over and plummet, and, in the heat of battle, read it as panic of fleeing out-of-control plane. Surprise flipped to complacency. They relaxed, mistook control for confusion, and in doing so set the stage for a deadly, costly error. They would radio a victory and peel off, convinced the enemy was fleeing. Or worse, fueled by aggression and misplaced confidence, they'd lock onto the descending American and follow him into the dive. That choice, whether smug retreat or reckless pursuit, handed the initiative back to the American pilot, turning what looked like an easy win into a deadly trap. Disaster struck. Zeros that tried to cling to an American's tail and follow those high-speed dives simply couldn't take the punishment. Wings snapped like twigs under the load, control surfaces tore away, airframes ripped open. Planes disintegrated in a spray of metal and flame, leaving stunned pilots no time to react. And that was only one way they failed. Some would even have their engines quit. Sometimes the dive didn't just shear wings off, engines would cough, flood, and quit. A Zero that tried to chase the plummeting American suddenly lost thrust, stalled, and hung there, helpless, propellers windmilling while its pilot fought the stick. Below, the P-47 or Corsair recovered, surged back up, and fired into a sitting target. What looked like a panic, an American plummet had become a lethal trap. By the time the Japanese high command finally realized their aces weren't facing panicked cowards, but were being methodically outmaneuvered, the damage was already baked in, squadrons thinned, replaceable pilots gone, tactics ossified into a doctrine that no longer fit the fight. What looked like isolated losses were actually a strategic revolution unfolding in plain sight. Americans had discovered a way to weaponize what the manuals called a weakness, to turn altitude into invulnerability, and to dictate how battles began and ended. Recognition came too late to undo the attrition, and that delay turned a handful of desperate improvisations into a permanent, war-winning advantage. For the first time, the sky answered to American timing, not Japanese reflex. Squadrons learned to pick the altitude, the angle, and the moment to strike. They simply would not be drawn into the horizontal dogfight that had been the Zero's playground. That refusal was a weapon. By denying the enemy the fight he wanted, the Americans controlled the tempo, dictating when to dive, when to climb, when to vanish. The Japanese scrambled to understand, often realizing too late they'd been baited. In short order, the whole air war flipped onto its head, vertical by design, lethal by choice, and the Zero's old mastery was rendered moot. Instead, they forced a new, vertical war of dives and climbs, a fight on terms the Zero couldn't meet. The Americans stopped trading tight circles for honor and started trading altitude for speed, converting height into brutal kinetic energy and dictating when and where the blows would land. Dive, pull hard, roll, and climb back out on your terms. Short, savage passes. The Zero could dance sideways, but it couldn't live with sustained vertical energy fights. Its light frame and engine quirks were fatal in a high-speed dive. Once the rhythm changed, the old master of the horizontal fight was finished. The master of the horizontal fight was now obsolete. Maneuvering skill still mattered, but not the slow, graceful ballet the Zero had always owned. Once the Americans refused that dance, once they chose altitude, speed, and brutal verticality, the rules changed. Dives became weapons, climbing energy became armor. Zeros that could outturn a wildcat found themselves helpless against a thunderbolt roaring down from above. The battlefield flipped from circles to ladders of speed and altitude. Tactics that had been scorned as reckless now dictated survival. What began as an act of desperation became the new grammar of combat, and an old champion of the sky simply vanished. It started as a whispered trick in foxholes and flight lines, dangerous, stupid, and utterly effective, and before long that whispered trick became doctrine. What a handful of terrified, inventive men discovered in the Pacific rewrote the air war. Tactics born of fear were codified into training syllabi. Squadron leaders swapped secrecy for strategy, and whole groups relearned how to fight from altitude instead of inside a turn. The old rules died quietly. New ones marched onto carrier decks and into briefing rooms. That desperate gamble, practiced between missions and passed mouth to mouth, had become the organizing logic of an entire air force, practical, brutal, and decisive. Back in the United States, the war's hard lessons didn't stay overseas. They came home and changed the syllabus. Flight schools tore up old pages that warned against negative Gs and wrote new ones teaching the inverted dive, the timing, the muscle tensing, and how to trade altitude for brutal, decisive speed. Veterans who'd kept the trick secret stood at the front of classrooms, passing down dirty little details between chalkboards and flight lines. Instructors ran drills, sims, and brutal repetition until the maneuver lost its stigma and became muscle memory. In one season, the knowledge gap flipped. What had been outlawed became official, and doctrine finally matched the fight. The very techniques developed outside of and in defiance of official channels were now the foundation of American air superiority for the rest of the war. What began as whispered tricks and dangerous gambles on dusty Pacific strips moved into briefing rooms and flight schools. Veterans showed rookies, squadron leaders codified maneuvers, and training syllabi were rewritten to favor vertical, energy-based fights. A tactic born from terror became doctrine. It saved lives, shattered myths about the Zero, and reshaped aircraft handling and pilot thinking. By war's end, the inverted dive, once taboo, was no longer a secret lifeline, but an institutional tool that helped win the skies. The legacy of that desperate choice is written into the DNA of modern air combat. What began as an outlawed, heart-stopping gamble became doctrine. Inverted dives and other negative G moves that once paralyzed pilots with red out are now taught as routine defensive art at Top Gun and in training syllabi. Pilots learn to turn pain into advantage, to trade a few terrifying seconds of blindness for speed, separation, and control. The improvisations born on Pacific airfields rewired tactics, flight schools, and aircraft design. Today, when a young pilot practices a split S, they're following a line back to men who chose survival over rulebooks and won. The readout that terrified pilots in 1943 is today treated like another box to check on a syllabus, understood, mitigated, and trained for. Modern fighters are built with stronger frames, fuel systems that tolerate unusual attitudes, and cockpits and suits that help pilots ride heavy negative Gs. Flight schools teach controlled inverted dives, muscle bracing, and recovery drills. Simulators let rookies feel the crimson blur without risking a single wing. What was once a desperate secret escape has been folded into doctrine, from carrier briefings to elite Top Gun syllabi, proof that battlefield improvisation can become institutional wisdom. What began as a terrified, forbidden improvisation in the heat of combat became something much bigger, a weaponized lesson that flipped the sky on its head. Pilots who dared the readout turned pain into advantage, trade-offs into tactics, and rumor into doctrine. Those desperate dives exposed the Zero's hidden weaknesses, rewired squadron strategy, and seeded training programs back home. Innovation here didn't come from committees or blueprints. It came from men staring into a crimson blur with death at their tail, and only one rule left: survive. Decades later, that brutal creativity still echoes in how we teach and fly.